And are you well?
Yeah, I'm feeling much better. I still have a little bit of a
I,
cough, but
as I said when I saw your email that came through this end, like 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning or something, by the
mm,
time I looked for it, I was getting a bit concerned because there was nothing coming out from you. There was no YouTube, no Substack, no nothing.
oh yeah,
And it was like, oh, did he say he was away again or did he not? Or what? And I was okay, let me, maybe I should write him a message to say, are you okay? Are we meeting? And then, of course, there was the note.
yeah, yeah. I was
Oh,
away, and actually, sometimes when I go away, excuse me, I queue up a bunch of things, that will drop into the Substack. Or I suppose I
yeah,
should
yeah.
I
But
should probably do that
I,
for YouTube as well, if I'm actually serious
I,
about that. But yeah,
I
then
know I should.
I had planned on getting right back, sort of jumping right back into it when I got back. But then on the way back, I really got sick. So my daughter wasn't able to go to the reunion at all. So she didn't come, and my son came, but he had the virus, and so he brought it, and I got it first, and my grandson got it, then his mother got it, my daughter, and my sister got it, and my mother got it. I think that was the extent of the contagion.
So is that not part of the definition of a weapon of mass destruction? Mhm. Have
Yeah,
you not got to have you not got to worry about ice turning up? Maybe.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Luckily, we were traveling inside the country, and he did have his real ID or whatever, the internal passport thingy that they're trying to implement on us. I applied for one back in April before we ever went to Europe, and it has never arrived. So apparently, which is weird because in other places, like in Pennsylvania, my daughter says in Pittsburgh, they're same day. So they actually, they take them, they process them, they print them, and you get it the same day that you apply for it. So, but it's kind of weird that they're trying to implement this internal passport, that they're going to use to control, people's movements around within the United States, and yet at the same time, it's not available in a lot of places. Like you can't get it. It takes, they
Yeah,
quote it as taking 6 to 8 weeks, and then it takes 12 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever. So yeah,
that sounds like an unusually Stalin-esque type approach of we know who you are.
yeah,
We're not going to give you an ID card, but if
right.
you haven't got one,
You
you're
can't
for
travel.
it.
Yeah, you can't. Well, and ironically, you can travel internationally with a passport, and you can even travel in within the United States with a passport or a passport card. It's just that you're supposed to have this real ID, which is kind of an internal passport, and really, was sort of imagined, I think, as a first step towards some type of a, much more extensive, vaccine passport if we ever needed a vaccine passport again, or pandemic, control device, or maybe even, if you're a conspiracy theorist, social credit or something like that. But they're having so much trouble implementing it.
And but
Hmm.
are you using and implementing the good, well worked out Chinese software, or are you going to try it? Do you think they're going to try and write it from scratch?
I don't know. I don't know. They could probably just adapt TikTok
One,
if they could
one,
get everybody to
one.
use TikTok.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, one thing I did notice today that was when I noticed it, I thought, oh, I'll leave it alone for a little while.
Hmm.
But you might have seen there's this change in we've managed to prescribe is the word. We've managed to prescribe a protest group or pro-Palestinian one as being under our terrorism laws. They're now a supposed terrorist group at the same level of Hamas and ISIS and all the rest of it. Yet most of the members are 60 years old plus, little old ladies with their perm and their handbag going on protests. There was some comments
Excuse me.
about those people that get convicted under that law might find that they are a bit like ICE are putting people in San Salvador or whatever and saying, once you go, you're never coming back. They're putting those protesters in the same bucket. They're not saying it's you're going to San Salvador. It's you're going outside the UK. Your UK citizenship, passport, and all the rest of it are being revoked simply because you are standing there with a piece of paper that says, I support whatever it's called, Palestinian justice or whatever. Somebody managed to do an almost identical looking poster, but instead of using the word Palestine or Palestinian, used the word plasticine, i.e. that modelling clay, the Aardman, Wallace and Gromit models come from.
Right.
It got nicked, and then look, it got like 2 days later, 3 days later, I realised their mistake and let it go. And it's like, yeah, okay, now let's see that roll through the courts when he does it for wrongful arrest, defamation, God knows what else.
Yeah.
You know? And that would be quite interesting to see. But on the similar thing, on the green climate people side of that sort of protest, one of the people that got arrested 2-3 years ago was a guy called Roger Hallam, who's a major contributor to The Ecologist magazine and a few other bits and pieces. His crime was sitting down to organise, not actually turn up, but organise one of the Just Stop Oil type protests where they sit down in the motorway. So we close the motorway. He got released this week. I don't know exactly, but it's over a year, but less than 2, of what was a 5-year sentence got reduced to 4-year sentence on appeal. So he's out. But how long it is before he's back in again, don't know with the current regime. So he was arrested under a Tory government. I think he even got arrested. The original arrest might have been under Theresa May. So his court case would have been possibly while Lettuce was in. He managed to skip the next guy, and now of course Starmer's effectively let him out. But there doesn't seem to be much on the main news. It's only through sort of back channels that you've recognised he's gone. It's not come up on the news for whatever reason. We'll see. Anyway,
yeah. Interesting. So
I mean, or whatever.
Are we finishing the book today? Does 21 take us to the end?
Can't make it.
Doesn't? Okay. Well, I've read or listened and read to the end, so let me figure out where 21 is, so I can talk about the 2 things in this book that have really, kind of jumped out at me are first that element in the beginning when they were talking about those little Italian notebooks and the transcribing of stuff, sort of expanding the scope of literate culture in a way that I hadn't anticipated, because I had always sort of thought of the printing press and the moment of of movable type kind of coming to Europe as the big kind of inciting incident of the Renaissance and Enlightenment and all of that. But the other thing, and it may be a little bit later in the thing, but the other thing that has really sort of jumped out at me is this distinction that he makes between process and product.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that idea actually quite a lot. And so that's something that I hadn't really thought about it in exactly, about my own work in exactly those terms, but I do think that that's an element of, sort of taking something that is originally imagined or envisioned as being for print, for a book, right, as kind of an endpoint, and thinking of it as, being part of a digital project, which, just by its nature is much more changeable and mutable in time, right? And can be amended and added to, and and links can be added and things like that. So it's something that's never really kind of quite done. And so that something that's been in my mind a lot.
But it seems like too that piece isn't as heavily pushed in early academic settings, when you're in third, fourth, fifth, even to the end of high school, as here's a reason to take notes. And usually note taking is described more as a process of, I'm saying this now, you're gonna forget it, so write it down so you can just remember it, rather than write it down not so that you can remember it, but so that you can actively use it off in the future. And I like you, I think I read over the limit, so it may have been in chapter 22, somewhere around there, that he talks about William James, I think it was Henry James's writing, that he jots this weird thing down that he observed one day that was quirky and bizarre, and then years later he's flipping through and he owes a short story to a publisher. He takes the idea from one place, and then he's got a list of character names that he's been compiling because he collects quirky weird names, and he uses one of those names. So he takes these little weird pieces that he's collected from reality, and then he turns it into fiction.
Yeah.
Because, reality is always stranger than fiction, so the best fiction is going to come from the reality.
Yeah.
But doing that, saying it here is great, but modeling it as a teacher or an educator, or really highlighting, hey, this is how this is done. This is how people have done it. Or you take your scientific observations, you write them down on index cards, and suddenly you're as famous as Carl Linnaeus.
Yeah.
And he kind of misses that point I think he gave a page and a half to Linnaeus, probably because he's talking about index cards more than notebooks.
Yeah.
But Linnaeus wrote the same book 8 times over his span of his career with different titles, and created this massive tome that still is talked about, and it's probably not as read today as it was back in his day. But he wrote the same thing 4 or 5 different times, and each time it became bigger, thicker, and more dense, and had more stuff in it. Literally that's how he evolved his career. Or in watching some of the other examples that he kind of weaves throughout the story, it's not as obvious in some cases what these things are building to, or necessarily, like Da Vinci's notebooks had all kinds of fun, interesting scientific stuff, but he didn't publish it, so it didn't benefit humanity the way the building up of his artistic, diagrams may have helped his art.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and by the same token, it was a process and not a product.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference with Linnaeus is that he was sort of productizing his process in successive editions, right? And that's a model from from legitimate kind of academic publishing, right? Is that you have you have a series, you have a textbook or something, or a text that has a series of editions that have added sections or revisions to sections, or that reflect the latest research findings and that sort of thing, and that's and that's considered to be legitimate, and it also provides an economic reward along the way that that probably initially in that business model kind of financed the the thing getting done.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it was
if that's the case, and you have the process creating the product, then does that mean Tiago Forte or David Allen are productizing the process then in the other direction?
Yeah, right.
mhm. Yeah, the Darwin section essentially was that manifestation of just capturing notes, sort of ad hoc, whatever interested Darwin, whatever caught his eye. And then he started realizing that people were reading what he was, reading his notebooks, reading his diaries. And when he would return back, and so it changed his writing, and he started writing and keeping his diary in a manner that was easier for consumption, and essentially creating that as a product. And it was, you know, one sort of led to the other, and that piece was kind of interesting. The
I
one,
my favorite about that section was they're specifically, and he may have actually writing this. No, it was, but the word existed before and it was popular before. But Alan does not use the word fleeting notes
Mhm.
mhm,
or Darwin's like tiny little cryptic, you know, fleeting notes.
yeah,
But he does say he comes back and rewrites them out in full, and
yep,
presumably those fuller notes are the ones that he's sharing with friends or sharing with others. I was a lot disappointed in the fact that he doesn't mention in this section or segment, and I'm sure it's a fact he assuredly knew, but Darwin inherited Erasmus Darwin's Commonplace book
mhm,
Mhm.
and had it and used it. And it's a thing of, hey, here's this process that was in the culture at the time. It was passed down to him. So he's got someone else's notebook that he's
Yeah.
reading or presumably has read and is
mhm,
aware of, and it's been given to him.
Yeah.
And then he is doing that same thing himself,
Mhm.
but for others.
Yeah. That would have
Um,
been a really good parallel story to the Isaac Newton's
mhm,
stepfather's Commonplace book. But with the difference being, of course, that Erasmus Darwin's must have been just a freaking gold mine,
yeah.
because in Zoonomia and in the what was it, the Temple of Life or whatever it was, his last kind of cycle of poems, he kind of laid out the idea of evolution through natural selection. And so so there must have been elements of that in the Commonplace book, which Darwin had a chance to have access to and to kind of ponder on. One of the things that I thought was interesting was that initially Darwin's job is kind of the collection of these things, right? He's going on shore in in Brazil, and then around the other side of South America, as he's kind of going up the Chilean coast and whatnot. and so so his only job is to sort of go out there and grab whatever it is that he sees and finds. And so, I mean, so it was really kind of an interesting metaphor for the whole process, right? So you got a collection phase, and then you've got a sort of a take your fleeting notes, your observations, and turn them into something that's a little bit more permanent, right? And curate them, right, in a way, and then later on interpret them, and and kind of use your red book or whatever to build speculations and theories out of all of this sort of information that you've been sort of steeping in for all that time.
And all the while, everybody you run into, you spend 10 minutes boring them to death with this ongoing thesis you're slowly building,
Yeah.
which was a fun part that they said, oh, this wasn't some magnificent enterprise that he just unveiled at the end. He'd been boring everybody to death with it
Yeah.
all
Well,
along.
that was valuable for me because I had excuse me, previously I had heard a lot of stories about him, sort of keeping the finished manuscript of On the Origin of Species in his drawer for a decade or more, right? Between the time that he, probably completed it, through the, the 1840s when there was all of that controversy around, Vestiges, the Chambers book that drew all of the kind of the ire and the resentment and the backlash. And so he kind of, so the story that I heard was that, he kind of kept his head down, during that period. So it's interesting to hear that he didn't really, maybe he was out there, he was talking to people at least, at cocktail parties or dinners or salons.
It wasn't a secret, that's for sure. But I think there's a parallel going back to people that's already been mentioned. We've got, Isaac Newton and the plague period.
Yeah.
He's picked up his now dead stepfather's partially used, by the sound of it, like 5% used, but it's a decent size, reasonably thick.
Yeah.
Except for he's using that as his first sort of waste book.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not just James Blick who did the bio The Shoulders of Giants of Newton, but there was
I haven't read that one.
those instances where Newton's socializing and he's being given a problem and he solves it, and they come along back at the next whatever meeting, next coffee meeting or whatever. They say, well, how did you do that? He says, oh, well, I did this bit of math. And it's, well, where's the bit of math? And, oh, I've lost it. So he then has to go back and recreate it. And then in the process of recreating it, ends up with building a much bigger toolbox of stuff in math, doing more. That was missing in chapter 15, didn't seem to come back, which was a little bit of disappointment. But what I did think about particularly both chapter 15 and 16, is there's that English guy and the Italian Niccolo, current guy out of Milan.
Guicciardini.
Who actually got the bulk of his more recent graduation come out of University of Middlesex, which was my birth home local university, just up the road from where I used to live. They've gone back through, and in part they were doing what seemed to be like a documentary movie about the history of math. And then realised that the notebook that they've got access to is full of deceit, where he's modified bits, and particularly
revisionist history,
which is really, really daunting. But and then of course we get the Fouquet and Colbert spat, and with the cassette, is why would you do what we're all doing, as in write everything down, because it's incriminating, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you need to run your mafia style business with some form of accounting to know what you're making, right? So you're still going to write it down. But there was, and of course, the chapter 15 and 16 particularly are fully overlapping with Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle.
Absolutely.
And
Mhm.
it's and they sort of skipped around certain bits and pieces, but it was still there, and it was enjoyable to throw back. And then, of course, it's like, so what do? You check out a couple of the other names that you don't know, like the current Italian from Milan, Niccolo. Not only did he go to University of Middlesex, the bulk of the campus for that is actually a big country house with some grounds, a deer park, basically. And in World War II, it was the major interrogation centre for the German officer class.
Hmm.
And just up the road from me, and there's a picture of this Italian with two other people that have no real place in our current reading on his wiki page that says there's, oh, I can't remember who, but Fred, Niccolo, and Harry at a place called Oberwolfach. And it's like, I've been there, I know where that is. and it's yeah, another one of those little join up bits.
Yeah.
But from the photograph that says they're at Oberwolfach, you couldn't tell. It's in somebody's back garden, basically,
Mm-hmm.
or the back of the beer garden, the pub in the bar or something, just as easily. It makes no, and it's like, why is that on the Wikipedia page for this guy? The photograph, maybe, and the two people, maybe, but they don't get mentioned. It's not a very big page. It's only a few paragraphs. And why even mention Oberwolfach? And at that point, you then think about all of the notes that are in these waste books. And we've already said about elements of when they're not necessarily a commonplace book or a waste book, but they're cards. And there's even instances in the new chapter 15, there's talk of him copying Samuel Pepys's method of shorthanding to give a little bit of a coding structure so that people can't plain read his notes. There's all those little bits of information that are not quite hid, but not in the clear. And then you get chapter 16, where he's writing down all of this network of his spy work and how he manages to be seemingly one step ahead of everybody else, which turned out to be his downfall. And there's all those little bits and pieces that you make a note of, and then go, oh, should I have said that? Could I have said that? Do I want that in my notes? Maybe not the permanent note, but I could have it in the fleeting note or the seedling note, and I can garden it out in the demonstration, etc., etc. And it's like, you then turn around and wonder, or either the TV program, the film, or the actual book that gets published. And they all need editing. They are all part of that editing. It's not just the quality of the content or the correctness of the content, grammatically, etc., etc. But there's all those bits that get left out. And it's like, I want the book of the stuff that you didn't write.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes back to what you were saying, that I think explicitly that would be really interesting would be, so where's Charles Darwin's grandson or granddaughter saying, I've got great granddad's commonplace book, and these are the bits that Charles didn't use,
Mhm.
but Erasmus wrote down.
Right.
And that then brought me back to the bit that's missing in these notes generally, that is mentioned and is also mentioned elsewhere and has come up in some of our readings about letters going backwards and forwards to making a more formal correspondence that is very much part of the Baruch cycle, because a lot of the action is by letters going backward and forward, and every now and then some getting lost or delayed, so
Right.
people don't. They've got to go back and reread the letters in order sometimes. And there's that Dava Sobel book that is the letters between Galileo and his daughter,
Mm.
who's up the road a few miles from when he's in
When he's under house arrest.
Florence.
Yeah. Mhm.
Might be Panama, but whatever. And all those little bits, pieces of day-to-day chit-chat, but because you can't get on the phone and there's no email, etc., goes into a letter. And now we've got 75 out of 100 letters that went backwards and forwards. And it's also the same period that even within this current book, there's been talk about making a fair back copy, because there's no carbon paper,
Mhm.
so that you've got your half of the conversation. You're not just relying on the answers coming back, which may or may not have the question put in. Because, like with emails today, you know, when you do on the older versions of the email client, you do a reply all or do a reply, and all of the original email gets the sort of a claret arrowhead, so you can see what have you inserted versus what the other person has already said. And all those tips and tricks and stuff that are beginning to poke out of this. I've enjoyed this one for much of those reasons, more so than those 2 or 3 books that we've read on reading with notes that are very much more on here's the line-by-line recipe of the techniques.
Yeah.
Because it gives it context, gives it reason, gives it
Mhm.
progress. This is what used to be done, this is what's now done, and this may be why.
And also because we see it resulting in something, right? In these little vignettes that we're getting in
Yeah, and
right. I've
and in
Readwise
part,
has
we've already
been
done the
feeding
other
me Bob Dodo's book that we read a while back. Regular snippets of that. For some reason, it's in the heavy rotation right now in the algorithm, and I'm finding that it's sort of like, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but you know, so what? And this, I think that the advantage of the way that Alan has organized this and built it around these stories is that it gives you the so what. So we get this, in like chapter 17, right? This I never knew this, this idea of the table book. It was something I was not familiar with, but then, then seeing it and then getting the Shakespeare quote, that has it, that it plausibly, suggests that, when he says, from the table of my memory, that everybody who knows that that's what he's talking about. That was cool.
On that, on
That's
that
the
technical point,
interesting
that
issue
technical
here
point,
is that we have a structure from our more formal analysis of note taking that we can impose on these anecdotes from the past and
Mhm.
say, well, that's like a fleeting note. That's this. That's this.
Mhm.
What's interesting in this book, and I wish, is that he doesn't ever come out and say there's no summary, right? There's never this point at which he says, here's the big ideas, right? The process of processing information that has been evolving over the centuries works like this.
Yeah.
We can read that into this perhaps. We can say, well, there's commonplace books and it kind of builds from this to this to this.
Mhm. Yeah.
You wonder if the author sees that, or he's just telling a bunch of stories. We're reading the structure into it.
Maybe. I like to imagine that he does. Chris, I think your point about the tabula rasa, I hadn't thought about that, but that it makes much more sense now when there is such a thing as a table book that does get erased. That all of a sudden this isn't just a, something from, just a deep, call out to some type of philosophy. It's a very, it's a much closer thing.
Yeah. Or an everyday, a commonplace thing, if you will.
Yeah, commonplace.
Yeah, one of the things in the book that I've enjoyed is all the different styles of the use of the notebook and just various different approaches, how they were used. And it's just, there essentially is no right way, but it all depends on what your purpose is. And some of it is just there are widely different purposes throughout the book. And the way that Alan was writing, there are pieces of sort of like the James Burke long transfer model, where you have sort of the storytelling across various time. And it tripped me up in the section about, it was the guy who, there's background noise. I got Tim. It's got background noise again. Sorry. But it was a section where the guy who had created Moleskin had run across the diaries and had met him. And I'm like, okay, so we're in current time. We're in like the 70s, the 80s, 1970s and 80s. And then we are back in the 1500s and 1600s in the next chapter. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, what is the method? And I'm like trying to figure out how the book was structured and why. And part of it is just, there are these common threads that sort of float through everything. And it's just like, here you have somebody who is using it just as a diary and using the notebooks, but there are these threads that also trail from the setup many chapters earlier that are surfacing, in the diaries, and the diaries then turn into Darwin, and Darwin changes his method over time because he's realizing that people are consuming it. And that wasn't his initial intent.
Right.
And so it's that structure of very different uses, very different purposes, but then having this thread that weaves everything sort of together and just different things surfacing at different times. And I like Chris's comment about the commonplace book, and like Charles Darwin not necessarily using the commonplace book idea, but it's like quite often with different generations, they will focus on different things for different purposes. And like, that has too much structure. I don't know where this is going, so I don't know what that structure is going to be. So they will take a different tack and different approach. And how sort of things sort of weave back together and pull together. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few years, just going through my own note taking and just sort of how it has changed. But then also I've gone back and rebuilt, modernized the back-end code for my blog and going back to early blog posts. And it's very different. Like every 2 or 3 years, it sort of changes. And it was just sort of like a daily capture of here's a sentence or two, paragraph on things that I found all in one post, just vastly different things all jumbled together. And then little by little, it got to be, 2 or 3 paragraphs on something. And then it got to be the 1,200 to 2,000 word essays, where it's just like, let me get this out of my head. Just brain dump this out, post it, and then move on.
Yeah.
And so and a lot of that is backed by all the notes that I had been taking in the background, where I'm just like, okay, I can use this.
Mhm.
I'm like, what was the source of this? Where did I find this 3 or 4 years ago? Is this a correct quote? Is this a correct assumption of what was said, what I read?
Mhm.
And then being able to pull that in.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. Excuse me. I think it's interesting that Darwin apparently, kind of sent the notebook back for his family to read.
Yeah.
Then once he realizes that it's being seen by more people, and it's and it is
Yeah.
and he gave all of those caveats about how this is not my conclusions, this is my observations, and all of that. But then he sees it kind of being turned into something else. It does strike me that is a not so much of an issue, but it's a question that we've
Yeah.
that we've had to sort of deal with. I think each of us, who
Yeah.
has blogged for a long time, it's like, what is
Yeah.
the blog? What is a blog entry?
Yeah.
Is it a kind of a stream of consciousness,
Yeah.
brain
Well-
dump kind of thing, or is it something else? I was trying to describe to somebody I don't know, last week sometime, maybe the week before, the difference between Substack and Medium. And I was sort of like, well, okay. There's an assumption of kind of a certain level of doneness,
Yep.
with Medium that probably exists to a lesser extent in some Substacks.
But I have a feeling too that when Darwin sends his notebooks back for his family to read, I have a feeling it probably, at least in those social circles in that time and that place, he would have expected them to show other people who came by the house and visited.
Mhm.
And in some sense, it would have been more like a proto blog. I'm going to send this to my family who's going to care about it because I care about it.
Mhm.
But people who come by and visit are going to see it and read it.
Right.
And I think that some of those, there was an evolving bit of kind of salon culture as well at the time
Right.
that
Mhm.
people would
But there
say,
would still have been some expectation of access control.
yeah,
Mhm.
oh yeah, you've got to come by and see it specifically, or
Right.
you might see somebody out and say, oh yeah, Uncle Charlie
Right.
is on this great trip and seeing these interesting things, and if you want to come by the house and check
Right.
it out.
Right. Or,
Kind of.
but it's a sort of a trust circle, right?
Yeah.
And so you can, so I think, I mean, what I was reading sort of between the lines, I thought was that all of a sudden he discovers that it's expanded beyond that, right? Beyond
Mhm.
that little
Yeah.
circle that he was expecting, of family and, and trusted not family, right? Because there was, and his grandfather, had been a member of the Lunar Society and all that. So there were kind of context for discussing this stuff. But I think he was, my understanding of it was that he was very surprised when he returns, after this 5-year mission, and he's very well known, and people, and he has, some type of status, partially because his former professor has also been sort of, promoting his.
There's an element of a Facebook type post. It's available to everybody if you know to look, or you're not on the shit list that you've been blocked. But you're not going to get it automatically unless you're a friend of a friend of a friend who, hey, maybe has commented. So you see the comment and you then travel up.
Mhm.
But part of what I was thinking about a little bit earlier was when you piped up about your Readwise comments
Mhm.
coming back round again. And when you spoke about it, the thing that I didn't get from that comment was are you therefore using that refloating to the surface as an excuse to take what might still be an immature note to say, yes, since I wrote that note, I've read a different book or I've read a different article or whatever on a different form that I need to add to this or refactor that one into a new one, etc., etc. And I've changed my ebook reader recently, but it's just a little bit smoother on grabbing the notes with comments and then giving them to me in a way that I can easily drop into Obsidian. It was always a bit of a clutch before.
Mm-hmm.
And allows me to do a little bit more pre-adding of tags or something similar, so that when I take it over, it might be about this book. The tag might actually say, we've got Darwin here, but we haven't yet mentioned Stephen Jay Gould.
Mm-hmm.
But when you next pick up something from Steve, or a comment about Mismeasure of Man, or another step removed about bell curve of Murray, don't get the Murrays mixed up, because there's a British guy that's Murray that's in the political sphere, but is very overlapping with the academic Murray.
Mm-hmm.
And I have confused them in the past. But the other thing about that Thomas was talking about was for structure, particularly with about book 5 of this group. Once we've decided which book, virtually the first thing I do is make a book note and drop the section and chapter structure in. Then when we do the sections, I pick up that bit, and that's the start of the notes for this session. So I've only got one note to look at when I'm talking. But thinking in terms of fiction terms as being the driver for storytelling, because that's part of what Thomas was trying to get to, is you have to tell the story. One of the books whose structure is really interesting in that context is Gone Girl by Gillian Flyer.
Mm-hmm.
That became a film with, I've forgotten what his name is now, but there's the actor that started off with Matt Damon doing Damon's first film. They wrote it together.
Ben Affleck.
Ben Affleck.
Yeah. When you read the book rather than watch the film, because it's slower, and the chapter titles aren't chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, they're dates and times.
Mm.
You realise that he is, he goes out to get the paper and have his morning coffee, and comes back, and his wife's gone. Looks like she's been kidnapped. Violence in the room. So that's now, and he's now just paces forward at a regular pacing for most of the book and most of the film. In the book, alternate chapters are he, him, she, him, she, him, she, him, she.
Mm-hmm.
But her first chapter is like 9 months earlier.
Right.
And slowly but surely, as we can build, they come together. And oddly enough, the next book I read in a similar vein, had similar structure, but there were 5 people.
Hmm.
But the stepping forward
And they converged.
added the next voice. So it was one voice, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and they were all looking at each step forward at the same event.
Hmm.
So you had one version, then 2 versions, then 3 versions.
Mm-hmm.
And in those 2 particular books, they were very clear, very obvious. No mixing up of the chapters, so you were obfuscating the structure you were using to really push the story.
Mm-hmm.
But many of times you have to hunt that structure out, and it's not clear and on the surface. And some of those are better for it than others.
Mhm.
But this book, I thought it was quite strange that the structure of this book is very simple, very clear, I think. But I don't have a problem with the fact that we start off in the intro with effectively today,
Yeah.
as in this is the story of how Moleskine came along.
Mm-hmm.
I was a sideways player with a competitor product, trying to get people who already had their own competitor product. And so that was a story I didn't know, in spite of the fact that I used notebooks,
Mm-hmm.
Moleskines in particular.
Yeah.
And then we've gone literally from the oldest to the newest,
Mm-hmm.
but each chapter is not necessarily starting at the newest. Sometimes it goes back further because that's when that narrow use
Mm-hmm.
or that particular style or that particular purpose
Right.
seems to have its origin.
Yeah.
So I need to have a regular new style,
Mhm.
and that's particularly where you have a wide-ranging theme, is quite a useful structure.
Yeah.
Versus partly because of this is also talking about particular people so much, many of whom have got biographies,
Mm-hmm.
if not autobiographies even. And most of the time, those biographies are very, very, very chronological.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even their Wikipedia pages very often very chronological, as opposed to theme,
Right.
which is in some respects a shame because you have to wait a long time to get Wikipedia type,
Mhm.
for instance.
Yeah.
But Isaac,
Right.
so the structure can be very helpful.
Yeah.
But the electronic copies, I always find, allows you to overcome the structure and jump around more.
Do you use that? Do you use that feature a lot? Like if you're reading an ebook, do you jump around?
I do when it's big enough and I'm not totally that interested in the whole subject, at least initially.
Okay.
The other thing that I do, particularly if I then, as a classic, and we've talked about it outside of the individual book, The Big Myth with Ostraces and Conway. I'm doing a really slow reread of that,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not reading it page 1 to page 500, whatever it is. I'm saying, like, the thing I want to abstract
Mm-hmm.
more than what my notes for our read would allow me to do is the climate change element in respect to people's health, for instance. So I'm using the search feature to
Mhm.
bounce around
Yep.
And then I might do, I don't care about climate change. I want to look at something along the lines of industrial safety, but from a pollution point of view,
Mhm.
not from a fire risk point of view that we've spoken about as
Right.
being the reason we have fire escapes and fire alarm systems to get people out of factories that burn down when in fact.
Mhm.
That might come up somewhere later in what I'm looking at, but
Right.
now it's not. But I want to pick up things like Bhopal, where there is a clear and direct link to death and illness
Mhm.
from an industrial accident, some of which is direct, as in there is an impact, the explosion killed,
Mhm.
but the explosion was the mechanism by which the pollution was spread, and that was a secondary, but still something that the company paid for.
Right. Right.
How do I then now try and put that back into court case type work to say that should happen to climate change justice?
Mhm. Yeah.
The big get out of jail card is for Mr. BP oil company was you can't tell me it was my bit of oil,
Yeah. Right. Well,
etc., etc.
yeah. And that kind of goes to this in which chapter is this? The one that begins with Conrad Gessner, and then goes from these volumes of natural history, but especially the plant, the Historia Plantarum, kinds of things, and he mentions Gessner, and then he mentions John Ray, which was interesting because John Ray, I actually used pages from John Ray, and if I had been allowed to include the illustrations, there would have been illustrations. There were in my dissertation. There would have been in my book from John Ray because he was huge in England. And then he jumps quickly to Linnaeus, of course. But then there's that sort of the volume, the big book versus the note card with the individual species on it, right? And so then you can have a system where you can say, oh, I'm going to shuffle my deck and I'm going to put, I'm going to, when I discover a new species in that genus or whatever, I can add it, and I can put them on a pegboard and draw the lines and things like that.
Well, he kind of misses a piece there too.
I was going to ask you about
either
your
in his reading or in his set, but Conrad Gessner is one of the first examples I've ever been able to find of somebody saying, okay, you can have a slip of paper with a fact here and another fact here. And Gessner actually lays out in one of his early books, okay, so you've accumulated all these excerpts from things you've gotten, which is how he managed to build up this massive kind of encyclopedia that he does.
Mhm.
But you can put one thing here and stick another thing below it or move them around. And then once you've got it, you can then fix it.
Right.
In fact, I think in one of the books, he describes taking a sheet of paper and putting string down the sides, and then you can use the friction of the string to put your slips underneath those strings and move them around. So it's kind of like a pinboard in some sense.
Cool.
And then once you've got it in the order you want, then you make your fair copy and you copy it over, and then that's how it lives.
Mm-hmm.
He gets there in the Linnaeus section, but he very easily could have tied it to Gessner because that was Gessner's method, and even more so, he kind of focuses on the huge volume that Gessner puts out in his lifetime, even before he dies relatively young in the plague.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't talk about the process there. And for Gessner, it was all about process, but he totally skips that piece of process on the Gessner.
So there's a little bit of an artificial insertion on Alan's part of change over time.
Yeah.
where
you
where he
know,
wants to narrate it as having developed through these different people when he could have drilled deeper into Gessner and found a lot of the change right there.
yeah. Well, it's one of those things too. If you're a young student and you don't see the value in, oh, why should I take notes? I'm going to remember this for the 2 or 3 weeks or the month before I'm tested on it
Exam, yeah.
and not worry about, hey, can I use this fact that I read in sixth grade in my PhD thesis? But by the time I get to my PhD thesis, I'm going to have long since forgotten that great idea,
Hmm.
you know, and you don't have that. But when you look at, and so you see this, hey, here's Conrad Gessner who just puts out this massive volume that really is, and he is essentially the godfather of the encyclopedia in kind of mid-modern history.
Hmm.
But you just see this massive monument. It's like you go see the pyramids and you're like, oh, yeah, that's impressive. But then
Hmm.
you have no idea, how did they build that? What if I want to make one of those in my backyard?
Right.
How do you do it? Well, you can't, because you just look at it and it's very hard to say, where do I mine those big blocks? How do I move those big blocks? How do I stack them up? How do I do,
What was
and
the process that led to this product?
it
Yeah.
wasn't even until the last decade or two that an art historian saw a kind of an early Egyptian art piece where people are actively dragging big stone blocks. And it's like, okay, so here's how some of it was done. But when you actually get that many people or even more people and you try to drag those stone blocks with ropes across desert sand, it doesn't work.
Hmm.
And then someone noticed there are two guys at the front of the painting with these big vases of water, or vases, you don't know it's water in it, but
Hmm.
they're obviously standing at the front of the line and literally they're pouring water. And when you pour water on the sand, the coefficient of friction goes way down. And suddenly, with just a few people, you can drag that huge block.
Hmm.
I,
Yeah.
centuries we did not know how this was done. And
Hmm.
it's only through, careful thought with this diagram of how they were doing it that we've puzzled out how it was done now, or at least that piece.
Hmm.
But he doesn't, he doesn't leave that thread for us. But going back to Tim's structure, when I did my kind of inspectional read for this, one of the first things I clocked about this book was generally it's structurally it's done on time periods, and he's doing little snippets of things across time. And then I, read through the references in the index and discover most of what he's talking about, I've either read the originals or read, which makes it easier for me to do a quicker, closer read of this book, because I can then say, okay, what references is he using that I haven't read the source material for? And then I can go read those sections to see, should I then read those other pieces,
Hmm.
which in
Hmm.
broad sense is what I did. And one of the reasons why originally when I said, oh, this book is coming out, it may be of interest to us and other things we've read, but it's not at the top of my list of things to read because I've read all the source material. And the other thing that I clocked and still kind of irks me is he's read all this stuff, he's synthesized it and created a timeline for us, but he's not pulling out and saying, here's what I would recommend you do. Here's this intellectual history. Here's the process and method that we can take 50 examples and then say, if you were going to be the smartest, brightest person on the planet and a writer and discover and researcher at the level of a Newton or a Linnaeus or a Conrad Gessner or, you know, whoever it is in this book, if you want to be the next Da Vinci, here's what I recommend you do. And he doesn't have that, but at the same time too, it's kind of interesting that, and I think about it from the perspective of things I see on places like Reddit,
Hmm.
and it's usually public fora where people have a question and that you can go to Reddit/commonplace books. And at least once a week, somebody asks the question, well, what the hell is a commonplace book anyway? Why would I want to do it? It's something I know I've heard of, but and of course, nobody is willing to do the research themselves. They want some random Joe on the internet to tell them, why should I keep a commonplace book? And the reasons are way deeper than two sentences. Nobody's going to convince you in two sentences in an internet post that that's what you should do. But a book like this might, because you can see examples. But I find half of fora posts on things like Reddit are either people saying, here's what I do, or other people saying, here's what I am doing. Am I doing it right? Could I do it better?
Hmm.
You see things in like r/productivity or r/GTD, whatever those things are,
Right.
like or even in the stationary space, which are some of the places that I watch regularly. But it's,
Mm.
hey, I've got this notebook or this diary, or I did used a few pages of this Hobonichi Weeks. What should I do with the rest of it?
Hmm.
And then, somebody might say, oh, use it as a period tracker, use it to list all the movies or all the books you watch, or use it as a commonplace, well,
Hmm.
whatever.
Right.
Just fill it in. Like, and no one is saying, oh, hey, you know, will it to your heirs in hopes that they become Newton. Nobody's doing that. Like, but here's a book that literally is giving you all of those advices of what you potentially could do with the thing.
Hmm.
But yet I've also never seen anyone give the advice, hey, read this book and you'll see 5,000 examples of what you could be doing, you know.
Hmm.
But it's also fun to read the chapter on Let's.
Yeah.
I don't, was that part of through 21 or it may have been
Yeah.
just after,
Yeah. I
but
think
he
that's
talks
20.
about
Yeah.
I think it was
I think it's
in
20.
this section. He
Yeah.
talks about
20.
the pre-printed diary
Yeah.
and how you could or couldn't use it or might use it or things that were thrown in.
Hmm.
Um, but it's interesting to read that right now because every publisher on the planet that makes, and that includes Moleskin, Lectrum, Hobonichi, Nemosiny, all these companies are about to publish in the next month and a half or reveal next year's
For
calendar
2026.
diaries
Yeah.
for
Right.
2026
Yep.
and forward.
Hmm.
And so you'll see this fleet of questions and answers like, what diary should I be using? Or I want a diary that has this kind of general layout, pre-printed format.
Yeah.
What should I use? Or not only what should I use, but I know I kind of want this, but what's going to be out there? And then who's going to have the best paper
Hmm.
for gel pens versus fountain pens or,
Right.
whatever. Just the insanity of the silly little questions
Yeah.
that people are interested in versus the kind of broader question he's laying out here is what should you be using it for? How should what
Right.
is the form?
Yeah.
And he
And
gives us lots of examples, but he doesn't, at the end, he doesn't say boo about all this stuff that he's learned.
Yeah.
What would you do with all this knowledge other than following someone else's footsteps? Or
I think
the thing everybody really wants is which one of us is going to come up with the next innovative use of a notebook that moves the goal line even further for everyone. And
I
that
think
that's
the
that's the
yeah.
holy grail everyone's looking for, but you're not going to find it because this space has been explored for centuries, you know,
Yeah.
and people are hoping maybe the digital notebook is the way to go and that's the thing that does it. But really, the digital notebooks that I've seen in variations are all just reinstantiations in a digital realm for these things. Maybe search is a little better because you can search
Hmm.
your 50,000 pages of notebook space,
Hmm.
but almost no one is using a digital product for long enough that they've got all of that you have to use digital search across, your
Right.
Evernote notebook,
Right.
your Obsidian Vault, your Google Keep Space. It's not all in one spot that you could really just search it all. In
Yeah.
fact, even Google, because they've siloed off all their products, I can't search for one thing and across 20 spaces
Hmm.
find my Google Notes or my Google Doc or the calendar entry or even the contact entry or cross-link them all against each other
Wow.
to search for Dan Alasso and find every single time maybe the closest might be some of the,
Yeah. But if you used Obsidian as your contact
well, yeah,
app,
but that's the thing
you
is you
could.
have to have it. But Obsidian is not the greatest contact
But
database.
that's what export import's all for. But the one thing about the book, before I started to read it and before I had a quick look, that I am disappointed in is there's no real talk about, or seemingly no real talk about, those techniques and usefulness of straightforward diaries in the context of, like, the diary keeper Gilbert White, who's 18th century as opposed to 17th century, and is, valuable information because he literally writes down, oh, first cuckoo, first, last sparrow, or last swallow, uh, flowering of X,
Hmm.
in and around his town for like 50 odd years.
Right.
And that seems to be a gap, shall we
Well,
say,
that's an
in
interesting example,
this.
though, of Tim, of finding things that that are not. I mean, maybe that particular one is not, but there is a lot of that. A lot of that. Kind of finding things in like the ice extent thing, and I think that's in a future chapter that we're not talking about this week. But that whole idea that you can look at these ship's logs to find out these things that we're interested in now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of opportunities within diaries. One of the things that he mentioned, he very briefly and sort of jumps out of his chronology just before he starts talking about John Letts. He quotes Anne Frank, and he says, "I hope I will be able to confide everything to you." She's writing to her journal, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support. And that I thought was an interesting. I mean, he acknowledges it, but doesn't really deal with kind of the use of of journaling and writing, just to sort of kind of make sense of the world and console oneself and and kind of work through issues and sort of self-therapize in a way that is interesting and probably deserves to be to be thought about. Yeah, expressive writing, right? That it does talk a little bit about that, I guess. And then and then the other, I was reminded of kind of the whole bullet journaling chapter later on as well. That does kind of go to these more utilitarian elements of what Chris was talking about. What journals should I use? What things? What spaces should the pages have on them, and that that sort of thing.
Well, now the question seems to be more like, what should I make my layout look like, or how can I make this page pretty? And oh, here's this cute washi tape, or
Yeah.
All the things that don't matter.
Yeah.
Versus how do I make it look pretty versus how do I actually get the stuff down on the page, utilitarian or otherwise. Although it does kind of strike me too that Gilbert White example, because he was essentially, I think they use the word parson in the description, but he's a preacher and a scientist or a naturalist. Um, and there is a huge overlap kind of in the early use of Florilegium and commonplace book in the clergy, in the learned cultures, and then that kind of spreads into the sciences because those were the guys, whether you're taking notes for writing this week's sermon or you're taking notes on, oh, I found this seashell here and this other seashell there and this other weird fossil here. And then suddenly you're doing the same practice with your scientific notes and observations as you would have done with your, you know, moral philosophizing to create a sermon. You're just the story you're creating is a scientific one rather than a religious or a moral one. Um, but a lot of those, almost all of the examples, even, Newton himself was, and we don't talk about it as much, but he was also trying to turn lead into gold on the side, crazy as that may seem now. And he was the guy, and I think early in this book too, I think there was a mention of forgeries and trying to he's got notes on how to, you know, you know, I don't remember what it was, but it was how to skim amounts of metal off the edges of your coin.
Well,
And then he
final-
later becomes the head of the mint to prevent those kinds of
Yeah.
things that he was doing in his
So
very
forgeries and clipping coins.
Did he invent milled coins, or was he just one of the first people to use them in Europe?
I think from memory, he's the one that came up with the milling, the vertical line
Right.
across the
Yeah.
thickness.
Yeah.
From memory, it was his big thing. He's one of a few people that we know of in that context that is mainly known for things like the calculus and the optics, but he also had quite a few people hung because when he was the superintendent and then the master of the mint, you were effectively your own judge, jury, and executioner for much of what the Secret Service does in the US outside of protection of orange peel, etc.
Mhm.
The other similar one that struck me with all the glorification of Newton and the use of his book, the one thing that I've always been disappointed about is, and of course they don't use the words in quite the same way, but obviously Newton discovers the spectrum because of the prism work, and that came quite early on, just before the plague hit, in terms of when he bought the prism, and that's in the book. But he goes from here to here. He doesn't go, what's there? I can't see anything, what's there? And you've got to wait another 130 odd years by the time William Herschel says, I think there's different temperatures here. And his control thermometer isn't put half a yard away, it's put right next to the output in the empty space next to the red. If we didn't put it in the empty space next to the blue, nobody would have found infrared as fast as we did. And I can't believe, in the context of everything else we know about Newton, I'm always trying to think outside the box. He didn't go, this is a series and it doesn't stop. He literally goes, this color to this color, end of.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Which is already, that's already a huge innovation.
yeah. I don't blame him for it because I see that as going into, and we'll use him because it's his birthday month after next. Young Neil deGrasse Tyson, quite, his big hero is Newton, and he quite likes the fact that his old style calendar birthday is on Christmas Day and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Talks about the progression of, Galileo starts with the laws of falling down and the speed at which we fall. Newton takes the next step and works for it. So it's all about the progression of the science, and the God of the gaps just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And part of the story that he tells on a frequent basis, Descartes' day job at one point was rewriting the artillery tables for Napoleon.
Mm.
And there's the story about Napoleon going to collect them, which seems very background. And so, but you make no mention of God in this artillery solution, etc., and other things. But I have no need for that hypothesis. And it's you see their greatness, but you see that some of that greatness is amplified by the fact they've come to a cliff and they just can't. They can fill in everything behind the cliff, but they can't take that one more step. That's their limit. And it's almost like it's a generational thing, standing on the shoulders of the previous generation, not just giants. It's quite an entertaining progress, I thought. And you see, and it's really down on the scientific method progress. Everything's up for grabs. These things are fixed until they become underfixed. Because of something somewhere else or further downstream. Newton's laws of motion work, but in a confined set of circumstances. For anything else, you need Einstein. You've got to wait 200 years, 300 years. So, but it did seem strange that he never asked that, what seems like a really obvious, so what's in the gap? What's in the outside? Given his, I want to transmute lead into gold and all of the non-stuff, for non-mathematical, non-physics stuff he does. And he doesn't take that. It just seems odd.
Okay. Well, and then the final chapter that we're reading this week is about using notebooks to lie, which I thought was kind of an interesting sort of a side trip, right? These and especially that it's the symbol of authority that is guilty of it, which is probably an opportunity. This gives you an opportunity for me to hold up my mug that I'm using today. So the patriarchy. So yeah, I thought that was a very interesting kind of side trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I almost mentioned it too when Tim mentioned Gone Girl, because, plot spoiler, she manufactures after the fact a diary showing her husband's abuse and then leaves it so that when she disappears, like, here's the primary evidence is her diary saying her husband did it without saying her husband did it.
Right.
With the amount of time and effort and forethought that it takes to go back and create such an artifact to, make somebody guilty after the fact is, The
thing, particularly if you read the book, I'm not sure how clear it is in the film, because I've only seen the film once. But in the book and in the film, she goes to a friend in like the last but one big scene change or big location change. and it's clear, maybe more clear in the book than the film, that she's done this before against that friend.
Mm.
What's not clear is whether she manufactured a diary, but she's clearly manufactured the process of getting money from people before, and it's the, if it works once, it'll work again. So, but do I need an embellishment? It's quite a common crime, espionage thing. But yeah, it's the variety of books that are two times, places, time zones, or time hopping. I mean, you know, there's a whole range of books that are based on stories that have got time hopping from memory, or for whatever reason, somebody picks up a diary from 2, maybe 3 generations ago, and as they're reading it, which is one set of chapters to you as a reader, the now time slot is being influenced by that story, because as people find out, oh, you know, wasn't my ancestor really ghastly, or oh, there's treasure to be hidden, or there's a fortune to be found,
Right.
depending if you can solve the questions in the
Right.
Or,
but I think some of what's in here or if we then particularly those of us that are reading it for the first time could say which of the key, what are the main takeaways you are going to use in your future note process. Because I hadn't thought of it in that context, or I hadn't thought of it in that methodology, etc.
One of the things that
Given that, you know, we pretty much started off with Sonkin and Luhmann.
Yeah.
One
One of the things that
finished off with
in this chapter 21 was the ways that the cops, once they realized that, you know, that these, you know, that patrolmen were lying, were, you know, the ways, the methods that they tried to use to make sure that these notes that they took were valid and were made at the time that they were, you know, supposed to be made, and, you know, and all of that. And that I thought was interesting. You know, it was also interesting to me that the idea of, you know, an inspector and a, you know, chief inspector and all these well, you know, all these titles that we hear in, you know, in British crime dramas and stuff, you know, that this is where they came from, and, you know, that these that they're administrative roles rather than investigative kind of roles.
Well, in some of my work, I end up by having to look at an old set of results, or a set of results that are being submitted for a test or an investigation or something within the building. So it's like, how can I externally validate without having to go and repeat all of this? Because sometimes it's not a repeatable item, such that I've got surety of the value of this report or the value of this set of data. And that then rolls into a couple of things that we've spoken about when we've got Dan Ari and that woman out of Harvard who didn't know that you could go back into Excel and say, show me the last 2,000 edits, and see that the people are actually falsifying the results.
Yeah.
When it was a pure paper copy, there were other techniques to say, can we see any falsification? And some of it is you just copy it, you just put all of the numbers into a database, and then you do statistical analysis of the numbers. Because we humans are terrible at trying to guess a varying number
Mhm.
to put down as third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth digit on a result. And
But then that just kicks the can down the road on, you know, at what point was the data element added to the database?
Well, even in modern science settings, there are notebooks made for laboratory use that literally have a page and then a carbon page behind it. And in some sense, as you're doing the work and writing it down in the lab, though, and those lab notebooks often come up in court cases for what day and what time was this thing discovered or done, for particularly in things like patent law, well after the fact.
Mm.
So did you pull out the carbon page and keep it as a copy, and does that match what was, potentially added to the original notebook later or not? But it's, and that to me that I maybe he gets to it later and I just haven't seen it. But that kind of the use of kind of lying in modern spaces, or even if you think of
well,
Facebook
if
or
you
Instagram
think
as
about carbon copies,
if you think of Instagram or Facebook as a modern day diary, here's what I did this day. Here's a photo of me. Insurance companies will go back into your social media presence and
Mm.
say, "Hey, here you were." In fact, I personally know an instance where a woman said, "Yeah, I have neck and back problems, so I can't sit and commute for long hours or sit at my desk for long hours, so I need to be on a medical leave, and the company needs to pay me back pay for whatever, and they fired me." And then the insurance company or the company goes back and looks and says, "Oh, but on this day you took your kids to Disneyland and you rode this roller coaster, and here's a photo of you on the damn roller coaster. Like, how bad can your neck and back problems be that you can do that?" And
yeah,
we know where you live in Riverside, and it's a 2-hour drive to Disneyland. So you obviously could do the commute that day. But
Mhm.
why can't you do that for
well,
your regular work? Or
if
another one that popped up this week, some government woman was siphoning money off of a budget and living a higher lifestyle than she should have. And she was taking photos of herself with these high-end purses and watches and things, living her best life, and then when she's caught, they can go back and say, "Hey, where did you get the money on your, $40,000 a year government salary to buy this, $10,000 purse or
Wow.
this $5,000 watch or whatever those things are." But
well, if
big data and AI are not going through and scraping social media posts
yeah, well, if you
to catch those people.
go back to the transition period from when you still had the carbon copy for your credit card in the swipe machine that
Mhm.
pushed the card through, to when you just swipe the card or push it in a slot, put a number or something in. In that transition, apparently I took an office desk and a large office chair in my hand luggage back from Geneva once. It turned out that, and the problem with it ultimately was that, yes, I had signed the credit card slip, somehow to engineer a copy that was the meal that I bought, that I've got the other half of, versus about 4,000 Swiss francs for a desk and a chair. And so you then get the usual thing, sign this piece of paper a dozen times. And yes, you did. And it's Yeah, well, I can't prove it because one that I've got that's now in the system anyway. Yes, that looks like my signature, and I've got no problem with the fact that it's my signature. But it's how absolutely sure are you that you can't remanufacture? You know, it the speed at which the paper moved was relatively slow because they were closing that element of the system down. So they had a week to practice. You know, if you're going to get 4,000 Swiss for one signature, then you might want to. And whether we went back to that, it took so long for it to come up because obviously there's 3 or 4 weeks before I submit my expenses. There's 3 or 4 weeks by the time the credit card company come back and say, okay, but what's this one?
Mhm.
And then you get the piece of paper, you sign it. Now I can't recall what happened exactly on that day, etc., etc. But one of the slightly more oddball ones was on somebody using instruments that I could see were probably out of calibration. So we asked for the calibration certificates, and it got one legally, and then photocopied the signature, but actually put it slightly different angles in the space.
Mm.
But it was an exact copy of the signature, and it's okay. And he used the same calibration service as we did. So I phoned him up and said, "Oh, by the way, who's got certificate numbers? Da, 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 the ones that I've." So he came back with 3 different companies, so they're all supposedly his one company. So he faked the calibration certificate, so all the work was likely to be invalid.
Hmm.
So we're going to finish the book for next week, or are we
Yeah.
dropping and moving?
Let's see what that looks like in terms of 22 begins at 3.
Yeah, I think it breaks down to roughly about 100 pages.
About
which is
100
what
pages,
we've been
yeah.
doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. I think that'll work.
Assuming you don't go through all the notes.
Yeah, that's optional. That's bonus
Wait,
stuff.
you didn't do that when you started the book? That was the first thing I did.
It's quite often where I start as well.
Often
or
it is.
really, at this point, the bigger question is what's the next book after,
Mm-hmm.
to get people thinking about that. Because that's always the harder piece. So that we're thinking about it now instead of in the last 10 minutes next week.
Hmm.
Yeah, at the moment, I don't have a suggestion other than what's on the existing list.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, we need to bring Patrick back.
Yep.
So, no doubt, it's got to be the word poverty in the title.
I still, another thing that keeps popping up and popping up and popping up in my Readwise feed is Who Owns the Future, the Duran Lanier book. And maybe sort of that, and I'm thinking about that. For some reason, I've been thinking about maybe because I've been thinking about my syllabus for my U.S. History 2 class that I'm going to teach this fall. I was thinking of adding the April 2000 Wired essay by Bill Joy, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. So I was thinking that maybe the Lanier and the Bill Joy would be, because the Why the Future Doesn't Need Us is, I mean, it is about 10,000 words long, but it's only an essay. It's not but that might be valuable to revisit.
Yeah. I don't think it comes out in time enough because I think it's like mid-September, if I remember. But Steven Pinker has a book coming out called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. common knowledge and the mysteries of money, power, and everyday life, which, you know, does fits in but doesn't fit in with all of his prior writings. So I'm not sure where he's going to really go with it.
Well, that might pair nicely with who was it that wrote that book, Gramsci's Common Sense?
Oh, yeah.
Some woman who I really liked, actually.
There's the alternative in that context is not true but useful book by Derek Shivers. It's a 90-page quickie.
I mean, I totally would do the other just to say that I'm in a book club that's reading Steven Pinker in juxtaposition with Gramsci. Like, you know,
Yeah,
how many book clubs in America are doing that right now?
right. Right. What's the Gramsci book? Let me look at my library here.
I've been looking at the book suggestions for last 15 minutes or so, trying to figure out where you guys have been and where it's going.
Yeah, maybe I don't have a copy of that Gramsci book.
We have broadly been reading or alternating kind of intellectual history stuff like this. Although I think some of the stuff we've done has been a little more dense with economics, social policy, poverty, equality.
Yeah.
Oh, the Gramsci's Common Sense is by Kate Crehan, and it is 2016 Duke University Press. And it's 240 pages long. I'm not sure that we'd have to read the whole thing. Just to use it as a kind of a comparison.
And Pinker stuff is relatively easy read.
Yeah.
It's sort of pop science.
Yep.
His academic papers, I really enjoyed.
Yeah,
that was the one. It was his Dawn of Everything book that kicked us off. Are we almost at the 3-year mark?
That was
almost?
That was Pinker. That was Graeber.
Or Graeber, yeah. Well, you mentioned Graeber.
Yeah, we are at about the 3-year mark. His last one before this was Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, and Why It Matters. I don't know. I guess I probably haven't given him his. I maybe haven't given him his sufficient credit after Enlightenment Now! !
Yeah.
Wait.
Well, he seems to be falling into the academic trap that big, well-known academics sometimes tend to. They get bored with their day-to-day research, and they start straying outside the lines, or they've hit the wall in their academic research and then move to popular publishing as a money grab.
Although sometimes they have legitimate, non-academic pursuits, like Chomsky.
Well, that's I mean, at least in some of his stuff, the Rationality book, I think, was just a pure like overview. I don't think he made any groundbreaking anything. But he didn't have a thesis the way he did with the his theory of violence over time decreasing, which at least required some work on his part. Yeah. And this one feels a little fluffy. It's almost kind of like Green, who did a lot of work in math and quantum mechanics, quantum theory, dark matter, and he's now written the same book 4 or 5 times, including a kid's book, which is great, and it's popularized the subject.
Brian Green, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, but it means he's not spending any time, or the bulk of his time is doing this, what I would call fluff, for
There's
a guy
nothing left to do in string theory.
And it's
hit a wall.
So is he making progress on string theory? And you really writing these types of books, you're writing these types of books and you're not doing your string theory work. So,
I don't
you
think
know,
there's string theory work left to do.
yeah. Well,
I think Ed Witten is almost getting ready to admit it.
yeah. Well, I think it started, and Smolin, I think, underpins. I have a theory that for a long time, mathematics was well ahead of physics.
Mm-hmm.
And for the last 50 years to 100 years, roughly, mathematics and physics are literally at the same spot. So, until you, or unless you can create new math theory to then explore physical theory, you're just stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, even if you're in string theory, you need a PhD or two in the math to be able to do that physics,
Mm-hmm.
or you need to partner with multiple mathematicians to be able to do the math to show the physics, which
Right.
there's not a lot of physicists in the world who
Right.
know math to the level that Witten would, or, two or three of the other people at that forefront.
Yeah.
So it makes it incredibly hard to do research at that level.
Yeah. I completely don't know what to make of Eric Weinstein and his theory. However, I do feel like I am sympathetic to his critique of the institutions of science as they're being applied, and sort of the hegemony of the string theorists at places like Harvard, which I think has been he's stated, all over the intellectual dark web for several years now. Yeah, it's an interesting moment, when maybe something's happening, maybe it's not. Maybe
Well, and that's part of the problem is that at the highest levels, there are issues with who's controlling what and how it's working,
Mhm.
which then only plays to the far end of the spectrum with the crazies who think, oh, science is made up, or we shouldn't follow it, or you know the the Gould Dawkins evolutionary theory debates of, is it punctuated equilibria or is it something else, which
Mhm.
then only gives fuel and fire for the people who think evolution is not a thing at all to, oh no, even the people at the top of the field can't agree on
Right.
on evolution, so therefore it's just all bunk,
Right.
you know.
Right. Because there's a missing link between the missing link and the other missing link that we found. Yeah.
So let's not vaccinate ourselves, because the founding fathers would never have vaccinated themselves, even though we have ample evidence of Ben Franklin not only vaccinating himself,
On
but also
smallpox
providing and writing in popular press, his own popular press, about abortifacients and how
Yeah.
best to abort, those unwanted babies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's well, and that's the thing, is there's this jumble of stuff that needs, that doesn't say one thing or another, and needs to get sort of disentangled and kind of worked out.
If only we could make sense of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. It's like that forest, that we're sort of building this narrative path through. And it's not the only possible path, but
Hey, those monkeys are writing stuff on typewriters, and what they're writing is important too.
well, you keep fixing the
Freedom of
typewriters,
speech,
there'll be
man.
enough of them for the monkeys to use. Sooner or later, we'll get Shakespeare. Yeah, I love that. I saw a Ricky Gervais interview, I think, where he's talking about his friend Kyle Pilkington, whom he likes to denigrate, apparently, but but he apparently at one point tells Pilkington about this, about the saying about the monkeys and the typewriters and Shakespeare, and Pilkington says to him, "Have they read Shakespeare?" Which was like the perfect comedic response. So yeah. Anyway, are you suggesting Stephen Jay Gould, Tim? You're muted.
I'm
Going
well, as a
Dutch.
possibility
Going
in
Dutch.
the sense of
I would like to read that. I have that.
Yeah.
I have that on my shelf. I bought that after
around-
you first
it's-
mentioned Lisa
it's been
Jardine.
around a while.
Yep.
And so there is a second edition as well, which was done in response to the Bell Curve.
Mhm.
And of course, his big contribution was punctuated equilibrium, that's been
Right.
not really accepted
Mhm.
in many cases. Everybody else seems to want to stick with the straightforward,
Mhm.
relatively smoothly operating evolution all the time. Yet, of course, when they talk about it, they always talk about it in response to events. Like the reason that this population is now split into two related species is because there was a volcano or
Some type of environmental stimulus. Yeah.
or something, some event split them, even if that event is plate tectonics at the extreme sort of thing.
Mhm.
How is that not punctuated? Because it might take a million years to succeed, but the Darwin's own and more from Wallace, there's that east-west line that splits Indonesia,
Right.
marsupials and placental.
Mhm.
That's not really crossed, and it's even a stopping point
The Sundance.
for humans.
Yeah. Except that it turns out on deeper exploration, right? It turns out to be less kind of hard and fast than was originally supposed.
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, David Reich's thing on the human gene
Oh, David Wright would be good.
stuff, working back into the archaeology rather than.
Yeah, we haven't done David Reich, have we? I keep mentioning him.
No, but I'm enjoying it. So I have. It's like my slow burner at the moment.
Mhm.
I'm not particularly worried about taking notes.
Yeah, I do like the idea of going Dutch too. I think that's an interesting moment.
Well, I must admit I like.
Yeah. Right. The reason I bought the book was because you had mentioned her previously. So I've got it on my shelf, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. But was outside of her radio work, not much television, but she did a lot of radio work. One of the best bits she did as a public video, which I think is on YouTube, she did a thing about finding out about her dad for what he did during World War II. And his child Bronson. And much of his work was on the periphery of Manhattan Project, various other bits. And of course, she never knew as a kid. So there was an element of lots of people who worked on Bletchley Park took their work to the grave because they never spoke about it.
Sure.
And literally the last 40 years, Bletchley's been a thing you're allowed to talk about, and there's a public museum and all this. But her talking about her dad, and particularly his World War II time, was quite interesting. But then obviously is echoed in the more recent film for the Manhattan Project. A number of people who were removed or blackballed or investigated, and but you also see it in the Imitation Game when um, character Scarlet, who is the MI6 guy, knowingly puts a Soviet spy inside Spectrum
Hmm.
because he wants to make sure that somebody gets back, but he wants to control the bits that get back. So even within Bletchley, if you know, the people in Hut 5 don't know what's going on in Hut 6,
Mhm.
etc. Um, and there's a few bits in the film, Imitation Game, where you effectively see that in operation. And the other possibility, I suppose, is the book that was used as the primary source, even though Turing's got family still around. Andrew, got his surname of it. Andrew something did quite thick, as a paperback, it's quite a thick book that is the biography of Turing. That does
Andrew Hodge.
a lot of the,
Hmm.
yeah, Andrew Hodges. That's quite good. And I sort of vaguely knew Hodges 20 plus years ago. And I think the
Wow.
book is about that old. I
Hmm.
don't remember whether I knew it before it was published or just after.
Well, I think we have just not clarified, but really kind of muddied the water, but more than
The
I like
other thing I say about the Going Dutch, well, is of course the period she's really talking about is also the Protestant versus Catholic
right.
trade war that then becomes part and parcel of James Clavell Asian saga. So Shogun and Taipan and
Right.
etc.
Yep.
And of course, Shogun, you guys have just redone Shogun as a mini series again. So,
Well, the first half of the
Richard
book, yeah.
Richard
So far.
Chamberlain is out.
Yep. Yeah, I thought it was. I mean, as far as it went, it only covered the first season. Only covered the first half of the book, but I thought it was good. What do we got for the? Oh, okay, cool. Thanks.
the first suggestion you had with Lanier and Joy. I think that would be a good combination. Going Dutch sounds interesting.
Okay. I would just because we've kind of run up to it and not run through the tape so many times. I would be in favor of Lanier and Joy. Okay. Okay, then that's what it will be. Lanier and I.
In a mail or in the
Yep.
group,
I'm
just
jotting
make
that
sure
down.
we know which edition, if there are more than one, etc.
Yep.
And the paper reference. So presumably the paper's got a URL or something.
I've got it here. I can drop it in chat. Oh,
Okay.
maybe.
Cool.
I may have overwritten it. No, hold on.
Yeah, I had my
Joy.
cool, thank you.
Johnny has got a YouTube video of the talk.
Yep.
Not that her body language is anything necessarily necessary, but she stood behind a podium,
Oh, okay.
not like she's doing
All
a
right.
TED talk wandering around the red dot.
Wow, at Conway Hall. That's it. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Conway Hall was interesting.
Famous, yeah, freethinker venue. Yep. All right, cool. Well, then Lanier and Joy it is. Thanks for the link, Thomas.
You're welcome.
And yeah, and I will figure out the best edition of Jaron Lanier and put that in the community notes or the.
Already gets the one I've already got. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, there's just
I
one
don't think
edition.
I don't think that there have been major changes. I don't think that he's been really super active in the last couple of years. So he's probably not been revising things.
All right, see you about.
Ciao. Have a good week.